Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. We're going to take an early look at the OLED version of the Steam Deck today. I just got this in the mail yesterday, and thank you to Valve for sending this out for review. Now we've got about a week before this will go up for sale, and so I'm going to try to cover everything that I can in that time period, and specifically what I want to cover is whether or not it's going to be worth buying, and yes it is, but then also whether or not it's going to be worth upgrading from a Steam Deck if you already have one. And so let me know down in the comments below if there's something specific you want me to try and test, and I'll see if I can sneak it into a video. Now today we're just going to really focus on the initial impressions. So we'll talk about unboxing and the case, and then also obviously the screen is probably going to be the majority of what we're going to focus on, but then also the updated controls, because there are some things that are a little bit different. And one last note before we get started, my nephew is a photographer and he was asking me the other day, hey, do you have any products I could like practice product shots with? And I was like, yeah, I've got an OLED Steam Deck. We should do some videos on this. So all the neat B-roll that you see in this video here, if you're watching it and you're like, that is so much better than what Russ usually does, that's because it's from him. So huge props to him for helping me out. Anyway, I think we're gonna have a lot of fun with this video. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start with a quick unboxing and see what comes with the new OLED Steam Deck. And the charging brick does look to be a little bit different. It's got a Steam logo on each side now, which didn't come with my launch deck, and the power cable is a little bit longer too, 2.5 meters versus 1.5 previously. And the power plug is still the same 45 watts. Now let's take a look at the packaging, and as you can see, it's a little bit different with the OLED model. And the case has also undergone a couple changes. Number one, you can see the logo now has an orange color to it. And I'm not sure if it's exactly the same color as the Valve logo itself, but it is pretty close. Now in comparing the hardshell case versus the launch model that I have, one thing I noticed is that the hinge as well as the strap are on different sides as they were with my launch case. Now the overall design of the case has been changed a lot. For example, now we have a Velcro strap holding it in place, and I think that's a nice complement to the zipper, which is already going to be holding it pretty securely. Now opening it up, first thing I noticed is that it does have a soft felt material inside, and it's also black in color. My launch model was gray and also firm. But bear in mind, I have the 1TB high-end model, and so the cases might vary depending on the price point. Now a couple other things worth noting about the case. Number one, it still has that little divot in the bottom, and it comes with a little mesh bag like it did before. The other thing that's really interesting in this updated case is that it's actually two cases in one. If you grab it by the zipper and then pull it apart from the rest of the case, it'll actually come undone. And so essentially you can remove that outer shell. There's not a lot going on once you take it apart, although you can't see how much space that divot will take on the bottom. Now this new liner case is pretty cool. It's super thin and also will still protect your Steam Deck. The way that Valve describes it is that it's going to give you just enough protection, for example, if you want to throw it into a backpack. Now, one thing I did notice right off the bat with the inner liner is that all the Velcro that was holding it in place with the outer case is completely exposed out here on the front. And it has a soft sort of furry texture to it. I think it's fine, but all the same, it's a little bit weird with a hardshell case to have something so soft on the outside. And I also couldn't help but think that maybe this would attract lint if you were like throwing it into your backpack. You know, a bunch of like tortilla chip crumbs, all those kind of things might get inside of the Velcro here. So I guess what I'm saying is I do like the fact that we have a smaller case here. Is one of my main complaints about the larger one, but I am curious to see whether or not this Velcro is going to cause a problem down the line. Now, due to its popularity, there are a bunch of third-party cases available on the market, and so I think that some of these will still have a place within the Steam Deck ecosystem. One of my favorites are the slim cases from TomTalk. There's a couple that are already out, and this is the most recent version. This one has a water-resistant outer covering to it that feels really nice and rugged, but then also it's nice and thin and perfectly fitting for the Steam Deck. Inside it also has a soft felt sort of material to it, and so it really cushions your Steam Deck when you place it inside. And another thing I like about this one is that little cloth strip at the top. That's going to secure it vertically as well. Anyway, this case is $30 if you're interested, and I'll leave all the stuff linked down below. Now another case I use all the time is this one from Waterfield. And this is a very specialized and boutique manufacturer, and so it's not cheap. It's something like $85 for one of these cases. However, one of the things I really like about it is that it's a magnetic seal, and so because of that, it's very easy to open it up and pull your Steam Deck out, and then same thing putting it back in. And so often when I go on travel, I like to bring this one because it's super easy to just grab it, pull it out like when you're at the airport. So in the end, what I'm saying here is I appreciate the fact that Valve actually ships this with a case, and I do like that they improved it as well. but I still think there's room for third-party manufacturers to innovate in this space as well. Next, we'll talk about setup, and I know a lot of people are concerned about transferring over from an older Steam Deck to a new one. Now, when it comes to your Steam library, there's absolutely no issue here. All you have to do is just re-download and install your games. And thanks to cloud saves, you're just going to be able to resume your games right then and there, so no extra work is needed at that point. However, I know a lot of people who watch this channel are way into emulation like me, and so as a result, there's a lot of concerns about what you're supposed to do about your ROM library as well as your save games. And this is something I brought up with the EmuDeck developer, and within 24 hours, he had already created a solution. And it's already up on their website. You can see it right here front and center on their homepage. And what they've done is they've created two tools, both for export and import. So let me show you really quickly what I did with my emulation process. Number one, on my old Steam Deck, I went onto the EmuDeck website and downloaded that export tool, and then I put it on my desktop and then opened it up. From there, it's going to ask where you want to save this new export folder. After that, it'll take all your save games, including the ones that are stored internally, and it's going to compile them all together and then put them in a folder that they call EmuDeck. Now, on the new Steam Deck, I went back to emudeck.com, and then I downloaded both the EmuDeck application image as well as the import tool. And I've made a bunch of guides about EmuDeck. I will link the most recent one for the Steam Deck in the video description below. But in a nutshell, all I did is took those two files that I downloaded from EmuDeck, put them on my desktop, and then ran them. And this was a very easy process for me because all of my EmuDeck stuff was saved on an SD card. So I just moved that SD card over into the new Steam Deck. And then once I ran the EmuDeck script, it picked up on all my games and BIOS files and everything was good. And then once I had that installed, I just needed to run the import tool. From there, it's just a matter of clicking on it to open it up, and it's going to ask you where is that EmuDeck folder. And from here, all I had to do is just select my SD card, and then it found it and did everything else. So within a couple minutes, I had my entire EmuDeck suite already over into a new Steam Deck. And there's definitely other ways to go about it. For example, EmuDeck does support cloud save, so you could set that up and then just use that instead. Either way, that's a very quick look on how I set up everything with my OLED Steam Deck. Now, as you can imagine, with an OLED Steam Deck, I was very interested in testing out the OLED panel itself. So let's go ahead and do a deep dive comparing this one against some others. And of course, I think the most apropos method is to start with the old Steam Deck against the new. Now, as a baseline, my old Steam Deck on the bottom is a 512GB model. And like I mentioned, the review unit sent over to me from Valve is also the high-tier model, which is now 1TB in storage. So these both will have etched glass displays, so it's kind of a one-for-one comparison. Now, first thing you'll notice is that the OLED screen is larger than the LCD, and it's actually 7.4 inches right now. They basically just shrank the bezels and gave you that additional screen space. Another thing you may notice is that the colors are different. We'll talk about colors here in a second, but first I want to do a quick demonstration of both brightness and dimness. So here we are at maximum brightness, and you can already tell that the OLED panel is much brighter than the other. And if we turn off the studio lights, you can see it's even more pronounced. So yes, the new OLED model is quite a bit brighter than the LCD one, and this is not even factoring in HDR. Now, along those same lines, the new OLED panel also gets a lot dimmer than the LCD one. And this is kind of amazing because the original Steam Deck was very good with a dim light, to the point where I thought it was a device you could play in pitch black, like in bed, and it was perfect. So the OLED panel is even better in that regard, so that's super cool to see. Okay, next we're going to do a demonstration of color and saturation so you can get an idea of what it's going to look like between the two models. And I think right off the bat you can clearly see that the OLED model is much more vibrant and saturated. Another thing you may notice to the naked eye is that the color balance seems to be a little bit different as well. If you look at this scene with Shovel Knight, you can see that the clouds above are quite different between the two. On the LCD Steam Deck, they have a bit of a greenish tint to them, but by comparison, up above, they're a little bit more in the red spectrum. And I think you can also see there's a clearer contrast between the black and the green within the trees. So just at first glance, we can see that yes, there's a big color difference between these two. And I think this manifests in various ways depending on the game that you're playing. If we look at SteamWorld Dig 2, you can see that everything has a kind of brown drab look to it on the bottom, whereas on the top the colors just really pop. And in some cases the color profile really seems to change depending on the game. For example, here with Planet of Lana, it almost looks like it's evening time up above versus down below. And I think what's happening here is that the reds are just presenting a lot more pronounced than they were previously on the LCD model. Here's another example with Sea of Stars. You can see within their dormitory that on the bottom LCD panel it looks very brown and somewhat drab, but you can see up top everything seems to be a lot more vibrant. Even the floor just pops with color. And the thing that really stands out to me with this extra pop of color is when we're looking at a dark scene. For example, here with Celeste, it's much easier to differentiate between the darker background and the foreground. And same thing here with the ensemble title screen of LEGO Star Wars Skywalker Saga. But we'll come back to this game because this is also using HDR, so that's going to be a different section. So when it comes down to it, yes, there's a huge difference in saturation and color balance between the OLED panel that we have on the new Steam Deck versus the older LCD model. You can see the colors pop a lot more, but then also it's a little bit different of a color balance. And I know Valve said they improved their color accuracy by a bunch. And I have to agree with that. If you look at the car on the bottom model, you can see it's a little bit more orange looking than red. Meanwhile, on the new OLED Steam Deck, it is bright red and there's no question about it. Now let's do a couple comparisons, starting with the Asus ROG Ally. You can see here that the color accuracy seems to be pretty similar, although I would say it's a little bit more red on the OLED Steam Deck. And the colors also pop just a little bit more. Now, one thing I was really surprised to see is that the Lenovo Legion Go is almost neck and neck with the OLED Steam Deck. To me, looking at this footage, the saturation seems to be identical and the color balance does as well. And to be fair, I've said previously that the display on the Lenovo Legion Go is one of the best I've ever seen. So I love the fact that the Steam Deck, which previously had a pretty crummy screen when it came to saturation and color balance, is now neck and neck with the best one I've ever seen before. Next, we're going to do an OLED to OLED comparison with the Nintendo Switch. And you can see with these two, it's virtually identical when you compare them. And I think that's a great thing because I love our OLED Switches. We actually have two of them, one for the kids and one for me. And these screens are great for comparison as well because when showing 16:9 content like Nintendo Switch games, they're also both going to be 720p resolution. So yeah, between the two, honestly, I can't really tell a difference, and I'm not sure if you will either. So yes, both these screens look very good, and I was surprised to find that the Lenovo Legion Go actually stood toe-to-toe with them as well. I think it really goes to show how impressive the display is on the Legion Go. And it's also amazing to me because 6 months ago when the ROG Ally first appeared, I thought it was an amazing screen as well. And honestly, I still think it's a really good screen, but it just goes to show how nice the color balance and saturation is on the OLED Steam Deck as well as the Legion Go. Okay, next let's do a quick demonstration of HDR on the OLED Steam Deck. Now this is the first handheld PC to actually have this feature, but also bear in mind that not every PC game is going to be HDR compliant. In fact, there are very few that are. As it stands right now, a lot of the more modern games will come out with HDR support, but still it's pretty few and far between. Either way, I do have a couple games loaded up already that support it, starting with Ori and the Will of the Wisps. Now HDR is a pretty interesting feature to me in the fact that sometimes I love it and sometimes I don't. And in the example here, I'm kind of torn about the whole HDR experience. When you turn it on, it is very impressive in the fact that the brights are really bright and the darks are very dark, but I also feel like I'm losing a bit of nuance to the overall color scheme. And so in this example here, I actually preferred the blooming effect that was happening with HDR off. But of course, this is only one of many scenes that you could demonstrate with. But also while in-game, I had the exact same reaction. With HDR on, if you like that dynamic range, then I think you're gonna love it. But I guess for me, I really appreciate the beauty of seeing everything on the screen, and so sometimes the dark parts were just too dark. I was losing a lot of that fidelity. And the thing is, when using an OLED panel like on this Steam Deck here, having it with HDR off is still gonna look a lot better than an LCD panel. And so as a result, at least right now in my initial testing, I prefer to have HDR off in games that have a lot of dark parts. Next, let's take a look at a brighter scene with HDR on. And we're going to use LEGO Star Wars Skywalker Saga. Now in a bright scene like this, you can see a lot more detail. On the LCD panel, a lot of things get washed out, whereas up above with the OLED panel with HDR turned on, you can see kind of every little nuance. In addition, you can see the color balance between the two is quite a bit different as well. And given the fact that this OLED panel is using a DCI P3 color space, which is like 25% wider than sRGB, I'd wager that the colors that we're seeing on the Steam Deck OLED panel are more true to what the developers intended. Either way, when it comes to turning on HDR in-game, I found that I really appreciate it in a brighter scene, but I'm not quite sold on it when it comes to darker games. Okay, next up I want to talk about the etched glass that's found on the OLED panel that I'm using right now. And this is something you'll only find on that higher end 1TB model. Now I think there is good and bad with using an etched glass screen, and I'm not quite convinced that it's a premium feature on an OLED panel. Typically when you see an OLED display, it definitely has a more glossy texture to it, and that makes the colors pop a bit more. And I think this might be partially why the Lenovo Legion Go screen, despite being an LCD panel, pops just as much as the OLED panel on the Steam Deck. And that's because the Legion Go screen is not etched in any way. In fact, it's very reflective. When I try to reflect the studio lights, you can see that they are clear as day. Meanwhile, with the etched glass Steam Deck, they're a little bit more diffused. And that's great in some contexts. For example, I don't like seeing my own reflection while playing a game, but it does make me wonder what it would be like if we didn't have that haze on the screen. And so we're going to do a quick experiment. I just so happen to have a screen protector from Dbrand, and this is made out of tempered glass. In fact, it came with two, and I put one on my old Steam Deck and I hated it so much that I took it right off. However, with the case of the OLED Steam Deck, this might actually improve the picture. So let's go ahead and install it and see what it's going to be like. So to start, here's some footage of Castle Crashers before I put the screen protector on. And yes, you can see that the studio lights here are quite hazy. Now with the screen protector on, most of that haze has now gone away. This is now a very reflective screen. It's not quite as reflective as the Legion Go, but very close to it. Now, as you can imagine, it's very hard to compare the haze with my studio setup, both with and without the screen protector. But here's a comparison with the OLED panel up top without the screen protector on, and then same thing with my LCD panel. It's also etched glass with no screen protector. Next, here's the same setup but with the screen protector on my OLED Steam Deck. And it's kind of hard to tell the difference between the two, but I can definitely see that the blacks are a little bit darker when you have the screen protector on. And here's a close-up where up top we do have the screen protector on and down bottom it's the OLED panel but without. And this is 4K footage that I've zoomed in about 50%, so this is still going to be well over 1080p. And I think there are three things worth noting. Number one, if you look at the bezels with the screen protector on, it is clearly more black. And then also this is a 16:9 game showing on a 16:10 panel. That means we're still getting black letterboxing borders beyond those bezels. And again, I think here with the screen protector on, it's a little bit more black than without. And then finally, the third thing that I noted between these two is that the colors are popping a little bit more with the screen protector on. For example, if we look at that big bad orange guy in the center of the screen, you can see that he's a little bit more orange up top than he is below. And so I think even though the difference is very subtle, if you are trying to get the most pronounced colors and deepest blacks, putting on a screen protector seems to give you a little bit of an edge. However, bear in mind, I don't think it's completely fixing the screen. If we look at Stray here, which is a very dark title screen, you can still clearly see where the bezel is and then where it stops. In an ideal situation, you wouldn't be able to see the bezels at all. The blacks would be completely black. So if anything, I would argue that adding a screen protector does not eliminate the haze, it just dampens it a little bit. And of course, you also have to contend with all the reflections that'll come with using a tempered glass screen protector. If anything, it makes me very curious to see the panel on the non-etched glass Steam Deck, the 512GB model. In fact, I'm seriously considering buying it to see if there's a difference between the two. And finally, one other thing worth noting, all of my studio tests right here are in a pretty brightly lit environment. And when you play the OLED Steam Deck in basically any other situation, it is amazing. So in a low light environment like this, yes, I'm getting a ton of deep blacks and it looks very beautiful to the eye. And whether or not you need those super inky blacks is really going to be a matter of taste. And from my own perspective, I'm not losing any sleep about this in any way. After all, we're getting an OLED panel on the Steam Deck that's both larger and has a higher refresh rate. And it's also not going to require as much power to work, and so you're going to save on battery life as well. So all things considered, yes, I'm very happy with this new screen, but the honest truth is that it's probably not the best screen I've ever seen in my life, and it didn't blow me away in the way that I was hoping it would. Okay, next I want to compare the controls on both the old and new Steam Decks. And in order to make sure that I'm getting a one-to-one comparison, I'm going to remove the skins from my old Steam Deck. And it's kind of breaking my heart because I really did enjoy the Dbrand skin that I had on here. But they're not super expensive, and so I'll probably replace this down the line. Either way, let's go ahead and compare the controls between these two, starting with the analog sticks. Now, the old analog sticks I think were completely serviceable. I had no problems with them whatsoever. I think the biggest complaint that most people had is that they didn't feel like they were grippy enough. In particular, the very tops of the caps would get a little bit slippery over time. In addition, I know a lot of people didn't like the grippiness of the outer ring as well. Well, looking at the new Steam Deck, the grippiness on the outer rim is still pretty similar, although it does feel a hair thicker than it was before. However, the main difference between the two is the top of the cap. Instead of the old matte plastic, it's now a more glossy texture. And as a result, it makes it quite a bit grippier than before. The tops also feel more concave, which gives you more space to put your thumb. And so as a result, I did feel like my thumbs were slipping a lot less on these new analog sticks than they were before. So in that regard, I think it's a solid upgrade from the previous analog sticks, and so if you didn't like the ones previously, you'll probably like these ones. Next, we'll talk about the D-pad. We'll start with the old one. This one has a glossy texture with a rubber membrane connection. And for the most part, I've never really had a complaint about this D-pad. I think it has a good amount of travel to it, and the pivot here is also very pronounced. Now, the D-pad on the new one is very, very similar, but there is one nuanced difference. And that is that the pivot here feels a little bit more shallow than it was before. So when I press down and shift the D-pad, it does feel like it's a little bit more shallow and maybe slightly more mushy. Now, of course, it's really hard to tell whether or not a D-pad is going to be good without actually testing it, so let's do a couple game tests. We're going to start with the old Steam Deck, and we're going to do what I call the contra test. What I do is push down on the D-pad and then rock it left and right and see whether or not the character moves. If the character moves a lot, that means we'll probably get false diagonals. And if the character doesn't move at all, that means it might be hard to press diagonals while in game. Ideally, you want to find some sort of middle ground. And here on the Steam Deck, you can see we're at the far end of the spectrum. There's basically no movement when we rock back and forth. And unfortunately, as a result, it's kind of hard to hit diagonals when you're actually playing the game. Now, of course, the feel of the D-pad is very subjective, but all the same, this is definitely a lot harder to press the diagonal than I would like when playing Contra. Next, we're going to do the exact same test, but with the new Steam Deck. And you can tell here with the Contra test, it's about the same results. The character is only moving a tiny little bit if I rock it all the way to one side or the other. And it's a very similar experience while in game in that the diagonals are still hard to press, but I would say they are slightly easier to press than before, maybe a 10% improvement here. Regardless, this is still not a device I would probably want to play the original Contra on. Now, another way I like to test diagonals is to try an older Street Fighter game. This here is the arcade version of Street Fighter 3 Third Strike. And there's two moves I like to do. First is the Hadouken or Fireball move, and then I also like to try the Dragon Punch or Shoryuken. And for both of these moves, no matter if my character was on the left or the right side of the screen, I had a lot of problems here. We're looking at probably a 50% success rate with Hadoukens and maybe 30% with the Shoryuken. Now, by contrast, it's pretty similar to the new Steam Deck, but a little bit better. Instead, I would say I'm getting about a 75% success rate with a Hadouken and maybe a 2/3 success rate with a Shoryuken. So I'm not quite ready to say that this is either Hadoukenable or Shoryukenable, but it is pretty close and better than it was before. So I guess the way I see it, if you already didn't mind the D-pad on the original Steam Deck, you'll have no complaints here. In fact, it'll be a little bit better. However, if you did not like the D-pad on the original model, I don't think the improvement here is enough to justify saying that it's going to be worth it now. Next, we'll talk about the trackpads, and physically these do not feel different in any way. However, when the device is turned on, there is a difference in the haptics. On the original Steam Deck, I felt like it was a very soft and subtle thunk as you moved around the trackpad. And so for me, it was always a nice pleasant reminder that something was happening as I was moving around. Now on the new Steam Deck, it's a very similar haptic feedback, but I would say it's a little bit more pronounced. And it's really hard to explain haptics without being there, but I guess the way I would describe it is that on the new Steam Deck, it feels like the haptics are closer to your finger. It's almost like they've put it right next to the surface of the trackpad. In addition, the feedback feels a little bit higher pitched than it was before. I'm not really sure which one I like better. I would say the old Steam Deck is a lot more subtle, but given the fact that the haptics feel closer to your finger on the new Steam Deck, it does feel more precise. So I guess I answered my own question right there, in that I think the new one is a little bit better. Next, I want to talk about the menu buttons. Now on the original Steam Deck, these were flush to the case and a little bit mushy. And this was something I didn't like about the original one. I felt like it was very hard to feel whether or not you were actually pressing down on the button. Now on the new Steam Deck, it's still flush with the case, but when you press down on it, it goes down further. In addition, it springs back with a little bit more force. And so as a result, it doesn't feel as mushy, and so I think this is an improvement as well. It's a very subtle difference, but I definitely like that they changed it. Next, let's talk about the face buttons. On the old model, I had zero complaints. These were glossy in texture, and I thought they were a pretty good size, maybe a little bit small, but they always felt very natural to me. Now on the OLED Steam Deck, they feel identical to before, so I've got no complaints here in the fact that these buttons just feel very good. The only main difference here that I can tell is the look. And that is that the new buttons have a more subtle gray label to them. And as a result, they just look a little bit more subdued, a lot like the start and select buttons on the Steam Deck. So overall, from a physical hardware perspective, I don't see any change here, but I do like the fact that it's a little bit more subtle. Okay, and finally, let's talk about the shoulders and trigger buttons. When it comes to the triggers, I don't detect any sort of change whatsoever. I've always liked the triggers on this device, and it does feel the same travel and resistance, all that is very good. However, the shoulders do feel significantly different. Number one, they have a more tactile feel to them, and they're also less mushy, but then also they're a little bit more high-pitched and a tiny bit louder. Let's go ahead and do a quick audio test, starting with the new buttons, then to the old, and then back to the new. So here I think it is an improvement, although it's very subtle, in that I feel like these shoulder buttons are now tighter and more snappy. Okay, and a couple other physical hardware notes. We have that orange button here on the top, and I've heard a couple people are torn about it, but honestly, you don't really see it when you're playing, and so it's not a big deal to me. And I kind of like the fact that, Valve, who has an orange logo, has an orange power button. It makes sense. Another thing worth noting, on the back, we now have torque screws, and apparently these also now screw into metal threads, which will make it less destructive when you get in and out of your Steam Deck. Now, internally, there's a bunch of changes with this Steam Deck, and we're not going to get into that here today. But I will say that all of these upgrades have also decreased the weight of the device. So my original Steam Deck is 672 grams, whereas the OLED version is now 646, so almost a 30-gram difference. But also bear in mind that my OLED model does have that screen protector on, which might be adding a gram or two. Another thing I noticed is that when the device is fully charged, you now see a green light when it's ready to go. Previously, the light would just go off when it was done, but I like to have this nice little green indicator. And finally, the other thing worth noting is that the outer case remains unchanged, and that's a really great thing from an accessory standpoint. For example, I usually will use the dbrand kill switch case on my Steam Deck, and it's a 1-for-1 fit, so I can just transfer it right over, no problem whatsoever. Okay, so that's really about it that I want to cover here in this initial impressions. After all, I've only had this device for about 24 hours at this point, and so there are a lot of other things that I want to test in future videos. For example, I'd like to test how responsive the screen is when it comes to touch typing, and then of course I want to do a bunch of performance and battery tests as well. One thing I will say that just in my initial testing when it came to playing these games, having a 90Hz refresh rate on this new panel is kind of awesome, because for the most part when I play the Steam Deck, I play more lightweight titles, and so as a result, I've gotten a 50% increase in my frame rate for most of my favorite games, and that's pretty awesome. Now, of course, not every single game's gonna play at a full 90 frames per second magically, but all the same, I do like the fact that we can do that on some of the more lightweight titles. And like I mentioned, this is something I'm gonna test here in a later video. Anyway, let me know down below if there are other things you'd like to see in a future video from me, and also let me know whether or not you already have a Steam Deck and whether or not you're considering an upgrade. I'm thinking about making a video dedicated to that one topic alone. As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.